There is a nation born from the only successful slave revolution in recorded history, a country whose founders defeated Napoleon's army, abolished slavery by force, and declared themselves free before almost anyone else enslaved anywhere in the Americas dared imagine it was possible. Haiti's African identity has never needed a laboratory to confirm it. What nobody expected was that Haiti's genome would end up telling a second story, one only visible when you place it directly beside the country next door, sharing the very same island, and ask why the two genetic pictures look nothing alike. The known history of Haiti's African roots is well documented and, by Caribbean standards, unusually specific. French colonial Saint-Domingue imported enslaved Africans primarily from the Bight of Benin, the Congo Kingdom, the Bight of Biafra near present-day Nigeria, and the Gold Coast of what is now Ghana, a demographic mix distinctive enough that its fingerprints are still visible today in Haitian Vodu, a religion whose spiritual structure and pantheon draw directly and traceably from Fon and Dahomean religious systems layered together with Congo cosmology. This wasn't cultural memory reconstructed after the fact. It survived as living, practiced religion, generation after generation, in a nation where genetic testing companies now report the average person's ancestry at somewhere between 84 and 95% sub-Saharan African, among the highest concentrations recorded anywhere in the diaspora. None of that surprised anyone. Haiti has always known exactly who it is. Here's the detail that turns this from a straightforward confirmation story into something considerably stranger. Haiti shares the island of Hispaniola with the Dominican Republic, a single landmass split by a colonial border in 1697, when Spain ceded the western third to France. Before either European power arrived, the entire island was home to the same Taíno population, the same indigenous people, the same starting point. Split down a single border, colonized by two different empires, you would reasonably expect both resulting nations to carry at least a roughly comparable genetic trace of that shared indigenous population once the DNA was finally examined. Before we get into what researchers actually found, it's worth sitting with just how confident that assumption should be. This isn't two unrelated countries being compared for the first time. This is one island, one original population, split by a line drawn on a map roughly 3 centuries ago. If genetics tells a story about deep history, this should be one of the cleanest natural experiments the Caribbean has to offer. A mitochondrial DNA study comparing maternal lineages across Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico found something that doesn't fit a clean, shared origin story at all. Taíno maternal DNA remains strikingly prominent across the formerly Spanish-controlled islands, appearing in 22 to as high as 61% of maternal lineages in the Dominican Republic specifically. In Haiti, on the same island, examined using the same methodology, Taíno maternal DNA was found to be essentially absent, statistically indistinguishable from zero in some samples. African maternal lineages, by contrast, sit at close to 98% in Haiti, among the highest African maternal signatures recorded anywhere on Earth. One island, one starting population. Two genomes that, when it comes to indigenous ancestry, look like they belong to entirely different parts of the world. Now here's a question worth pausing on before we explain it. Why do you think one half of a single island ended up with a strong, persistent indigenous genetic signature, while the other half ended up with almost none at all? The answer researchers point to isn't biological, it's social, and specifically colonial. Early Spanish settlement of Hispaniola, concentrated on what's now Dominican territory, involved documented, sustained intermarriage between Spanish colonizers and Taíno women during the initial decades of contact before the worst waves of disease and forced labor had fully devastated the indigenous population, embedding a Taíno maternal signature that persisted for centuries afterward. French colonization of Saint-Domingue, on the other side of the island, came later and operated under a starkly different social and demographic system, a brutal, large-scale plantation economy built almost entirely on continuously imported enslaved African labor, arriving into a colony where the Taíno population had already been reduced to a small remnant by the time French control solidified, and where the social structures that had produced Spanish Taíno intermarriage elsewhere on the island simply never took hold in the same way. If a detail like that makes you want to check what your own region's colonial history quietly wrote into your own DNA, that's exactly the kind of question this channel exists to chase down. So it's worth hitting subscribe now, because next time we're following the same kind of genetic fork in the road in a part of the world you almost certainly haven't seen us cover yet. And if you've got a population in mind whose history split down a similarly strange line, drop it in the comments, because more than one episode on this channel started exactly that way. There's a second layer to Haiti's genetic story that connects directly back to the revolution itself, and it may be the only clear example in this entire series of a political event leaving a measurable, lasting fingerprint on a nation's genome. Haiti's European ancestry component today sits at roughly 5 to 16%, noticeably lower than the European genetic contribution found in most other formerly colonized Caribbean and Latin American populations. Researchers studying this pattern connect it directly to the Haitian Revolution itself. The war that ran from 1791 to 1804 resulted in the deaths or expulsion of a substantial share of the colony's European population, dramatically curtailing the European gene flow that, in almost every other post-colonial society in the hemisphere, continued steadily for generations after independence. In Haiti, that flow was cut sharply, in a matter of years, by a revolution the population itself carried out. The genome, in a very literal sense, still shows the demographic signature of the only slave revolt in history that actually won. What makes this pairing of findings so striking is how differently each one arrived at its result. The missing Taíno signature reflects something that happened passively, a colonial social pattern that simply didn't occur in French Saint Domingue the way it occurred in Spanish Santo Domingo. No single decisive event, just centuries of a different demographic default. The reduced European signature reflects the opposite, an active, deliberate, violent rupture, a population making a choice with weapons and winning. Passive absence sitting right beside active removal, both visible today in the same genome, on the same island, separated from a nearly identical starting population by nothing more than which European empire happened to plant its flag on which side of a line in 1697. For Haitians today, spread across the home country and a substantial diaspora with major communities in South Florida, New York, and Montreal, this genetic record adds a layer of specificity to an identity that, culturally and historically, was never actually in question. Haitian identity was forged in the revolution itself, in Vodu's unbroken religious continuity, in a national narrative built explicitly around African freedom rather than colonial inheritance. The DNA doesn't correct that story or complicate it the way it has for some of the populations this channel has covered. It sharpens it, adding a second data point, the Dominican comparison, that turns a story people already knew about themselves into a measurable case study in how two colonial systems, operating on the exact same patch of land, produced two entirely different biological outcomes within a few hundred years. There's also a regional layer within Haiti itself worth mentioning, because national averages tend to flatten out real internal variation. Researchers examining African-specific ancestry within Haiti found that the most common regional groupings traced to the Bight of Benin and Cameroon-Congo region, appearing together with striking frequency in individual genetic results, alongside smaller but still significant contributions traced to what genetic testing companies classify as the Ivory Coast and Ghana region and, in some individuals, a notable Malian signal. This pattern lines up closely with historical shipping records, documenting exactly which ports along the west and central African coast fed the largest numbers of captives into French Saint-Domingue during the colony's peak. Decades of sugar and coffee production, when it was, by volume, the single most profitable colony anywhere in the world, worked almost entirely by continuously replenished enslaved labor rather than by a population that grew primarily through births on the island itself. That distinction matters for the genetic picture too. Unlike some other diaspora populations shaped by a single founding generation, followed by centuries of relative isolation, Haiti's African ancestry reflects wave after wave of forced arrival right up until the revolution finally ended the trade for good, a demographic pattern of its own. It's worth pausing on Vodu specifically because it offers a rare case where cultural transmission and genetic ancestry point toward the exact same set of source regions, confirming each other rather than complicating each other the way they have for some other populations this channel has covered. The Vodu pantheon includes distinct families of spirits, the Rada, associated with Dahomey and the Fon-speaking peoples of the Bight of Benin, and the Petro, a family of spirits that emerged specifically within Saint-Domingue itself, shaped by the brutal conditions of plantation slavery and carrying clear Congo religious influence alongside newer elements forged in the colony. Ethnomusicologists and religious historians have long noted that this dual structure mirrors almost exactly the two largest documented source regions in the genetic data, Bight of Benin and Congo, Angola, suggesting that Haiti's religious architecture wasn't simply African in some general sense but preserved, structurally, the memory of which specific African regions its ancestors were drawn from, encoded in ritual practice for more than 2 centuries, before any genetic testing company existed to confirm it independently. This also helps explain why Haiti's case sits differently within this channel's broader pattern than most of the populations we've covered so far. For the Garifuna, for the Sidis, for Beta Israel, genetic testing arrived to answer a question that had genuinely been open, contested, or actively suppressed by outside authorities. Haiti never had that kind of open question hanging over its own African identity. What DNA testing does here instead is closer to independent corroboration of a religious and cultural record that had already been doing the historical work on its own for 200 years, without asking permission from a laboratory. The genome and the drum were always telling the same story. Genetics just gave outsiders a second way to check it. There is a broader principle sitting inside this island-sized natural experiment that applies well beyond the Caribbean. Genetics doesn't just record what happened to a population, it records the specific choices, social norms, and violent ruptures that shaped how that population came to exist at all, sometimes preserving evidence of centuries of quiet demographic pattern, sometimes preserving the scar tissue of a single revolutionary war. Haiti and the Dominican Republic started as one population on one island. What separates their genomes today isn't distance, and it isn't time. It's the fact that one empire chose intermarriage and the other chose a plantation system so brutal, it eventually produced the revolution that built the first free black republic in the modern world, a nation whose DNA, 4 centuries later, still remembers exactly how it was made and exactly how it made itself free. It's worth ending on the comparison itself, because it's rare to find 2 nations this genetically legible sitting side by side. Travel from Santo Domingo to Port-au-Prince today, and you cross a border that looks, on a map, almost arbitrary, a line drawn by 2 17th-century empires with no regard for the indigenous population already living across the whole island. But that arbitrary line ended up sorting 2 entirely different genetic futures, one shaped by centuries of quiet intermarriage, the other shaped by a plantation system so extractive it eventually detonated into the revolution that ended it. Most borders in this world separate people by language, culture, or recent history. This one, unusually, still shows up clearly in blood. And it's a reminder worth carrying into every population this series covers from here forward. A border on a map is a political fact, but a border in a genome is a record of millions of individual human choices, made across generations, by people who never knew their decisions about marriage, survival, and resistance would still be legible in a laboratory 300 years later. That, in the end, is the real subject of this entire channel, not the DNA itself, but the decisions it quietly outlives.